They say you never forget the sound of betrayal. For me, it was the sound of my front door closing quietly, like she didn't want to wake me up. The clock read 2:43 a.m. It wasn't the first time Emily had come home late. Over the past few weeks, her girl nights had stretched into the early hours of the morning, but I didn't press her about it. I'm not the suspicious type, or at least, I wasn't. But that night, something inside me told me to stay awake. So I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark, pretending to sleep while I listened to her move around downstairs. There was nothing particularly suspicious about her routine. She always hung her coat on the rack, slipped off her heels by the door, and poured herself a glass of water in the kitchen. But this time, it all felt off. It's funny how the smallest details can trigger something in you. I noticed it right away, the muffled sound of her heels landing more carefully than usual, her coat not being tossed onto the rack but gently placed. It was like she was trying to erase her presence, as if she didn't want her scent to linger in the air. And the real kicker? No sound of the car in the driveway. I should have heard it. I always hear her pull up. My mind started spinning in a dozen directions, each more paranoid than the last. Maybe she parked down the street to avoid waking me? Maybe she took a cab because she had too much to drink? But none of it added up, and I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. I needed to know where she'd been. I heard her moving around in the kitchen, and I thought, screw it. I was done lying there pretending everything was normal. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise, and headed downstairs. She didn't hear me as I stepped into the hallway. I watched her standing at the kitchen counter, staring into her glass like it held all the answers to her secrets. She was wearing the same black dress she left in, but now her hair was a mess, lipstick smudged, and there was a flush in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. She didn't look drunk, no, this was something else. I cleared my throat, just enough to make her jump. Late night? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, casual. She spun around, her eyes wide with surprise, like she hadn't expected me to be awake. Jesus, you scared me, she said, pressing a hand to her chest. Yeah, sorry. I lost track of time. Where'd you park? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She blinked, confused. What? I didn't hear the car, I said, more pointed this time. Where'd you park? Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. That was it, her hesitation, that split-second pause before she answered. That's when I knew something was wrong. I parked down the street, she said, too quickly. Didn't want to wake you. Right. Parked down the street. At almost 3 in the morning. My gut clenched, and I felt my heart racing, but I didn't let it show. I wasn't about to let her know I was suspicious. Not yet. Anyway, she added, avoiding my eyes as she turned back to her glass, I'm exhausted. I'm gonna head to bed. She brushed past me, her perfume lingering in the air, stronger than usual, like she'd just reapplied it. My mind screamed at me to ask more questions, to confront her right then and there, but something told me to wait. If I pressed her too hard, she'd only shut down, and I'd be left with nothing but guesses. No, I needed more than that. I watched her walk up the stairs, my hands clenching into fists. Something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up early. Not that I'd really slept after Emily's quiet return. I lay in bed for hours, my mind spinning with too many questions. She was still asleep beside me, curled up on her side, looking peaceful, innocent, even. But that uneasiness from last night hadn't gone away. In fact, it had settled deeper, rooting itself like a splinter I couldn't ignore. I rolled out of bed, careful not to wake her, and made my way downstairs to the kitchen. The same scene from the night before played in my head on a loop, her fumbling for an answer about the car, the hesitation in her voice, the scent of fresh perfume on her when she walked past me. She'd lied. I knew it. Now it was just a matter of finding out why. My first thought was to check the car. If she really parked down the street, it would be easy to verify. I opened the front door, squinting against the early morning light, and scanned the neighborhood. Sure enough, her car was parked a couple of houses down, halfway up the block, as if she didn't want to draw attention to where she'd been. I stepped outside, keeping my eye on the house, making sure she wasn't watching from a window, and headed toward the car. The driver's seat was empty, of course, but something felt off. I tried the handle, it was unlocked. Emily was always meticulous about locking the car, especially when she wasn't parking right out front. Maybe she'd been too distracted to remember, or maybe she hadn't wanted to waste time with it when she got home. Either way, I slid into the driver's seat, feeling the roughness of the steering wheel under my hands, and began to search. There was nothing obvious at first glance. Her phone wasn't here, she kept that thing glued to her hand most of the time. No leftover receipts or bags from a late-night stop, either. I opened the glove compartment and rifled through the mess of insurance papers and car manuals but found nothing useful. Then I reached under the passenger seat, feeling blindly until my fingers brushed against something small and metallic. I pulled out a keycard. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't from anywhere I recognized, definitely not the house, and not her work, either. This was from a hotel. A quick glance at the back confirmed it. It was one of those swipe cards, cheap and generic, with the name of the hotel printed on it, Eagle Crest Inn. I stared at the card for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself it wasn't what I thought it was. Emily could have had 1,000 innocent reasons for having a hotel key. Maybe she met her friends there for drinks last night and forgot to mention it. Maybe it wasn't even hers, someone could have dropped it, right? But the longer I sat there, gripping that stupid piece of plastic, the more I knew I was just lying to myself. She hadn't gone out for girls' night last night. Not even close. I pocketed the keycard and slammed the car door shut harder than I meant to. A surge of anger ran through me, a mix of frustration and betrayal that burned in my chest. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more proof. She'd deny it, make excuses. I knew how this would play out, and I wasn't going to let her weasel her way out of it. Not this time. Back inside the house, I headed straight for the coffee machine. I needed time to think, and caffeine usually helped me get my thoughts in order. As the coffee brewed, I paced around the kitchen, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was she meeting? How long had this been going on? And why the hell had I not seen it sooner? All those late nights, all the times she came home looking guilty or distracted, had she been seeing someone else this whole time? The coffee machine beeped, and I poured myself a cup, trying to keep my hands steady. I was pissed, sure, but I was also scared. Scared of what this could mean for us. For the kids. For everything we'd built together. I couldn't think straight, not with her still asleep upstairs, unaware of what I'd found. I needed to do something before I lost my nerve. The keycard was my only lead, so I grabbed my phone and started Googling the Eagle Crest Inn. It wasn't far, just on the outskirts of town, a place people usually rented for quick stays or out-of-town visitors. Definitely not a spot you'd go for a night out with the girls. My stomach tightened as I stared at the location on the map. This was it. This was where she'd been. I knew what I had to do next. I wasn't proud of it, but I had no other choice. I was going to the hotel. 2 hours later, I found myself standing in the lobby of the Eagle Crest Inn, trying to act like I wasn't about to blow up my entire life. The place was quiet, almost eerily so, with cheap carpeting and a faint smell of cleaning products that didn't quite mask the underlying staleness. There was a lone receptionist behind the counter, a bored-looking guy in his 20s scrolling through his phone. He barely glanced up as I walked in, which was good because I didn't want to draw attention. I approached the counter, my heart pounding in my ears. "Hey, I think I left something here last night," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. The guy raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested. "What room?" I hesitated for a second, then reached into my pocket and pulled out the keycard. I can't remember the room number, but I still have the card. Is there a way to check? He sighed, setting his phone down, and took the card from me. Hold on. He typed something into the computer, the clacking of the keys the only sound in the room. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at me. Room 214. I nodded, pretending that meant something to me. Right. Do you know if anyone turned in, like, a wallet or keys or anything? The guy shook his head. Not that I've seen. You could check with housekeeping, but they don't usually turn stuff in until later in the day. Okay, thanks, I muttered, turning to leave. But before I could take a step, he called out. Hey, if you're trying to get back in the room, it's still occupied. The guest hasn't checked out yet. My heart sank. Still occupied? Emily wasn't here, I knew that much. So who the hell was? Right, I said, forcing a smile. Thanks for the info. I left the hotel in a daze, my mind spinning with new questions. Someone else had stayed in that room, someone who hadn't checked out yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was more to this than just a simple affair. But one thing was for sure, Emily had lied to me, and now I had the proof. The anger I'd been holding back since last night came rushing back, hotter and more intense than before. I needed to confront her, and this time, I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of it. She was going to tell me the truth, whether she liked it or not. But as I drove home, the knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't just about some hotel room. This was the beginning of the end, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. By the time I got home, the anger had reached a boiling point. I wasn't shaking anymore, wasn't second-guessing myself. I was done. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like it was just another Saturday morning. The sight of her acting so normal made my skin crawl. I felt like a complete idiot for not seeing through her act sooner. The lies, the sneaking around, it had all been right in front of me, and I had ignored it. But not anymore. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a second, trying to decide how to start. I didn't want to blow up in front of the kids. They were still upstairs, thank God, and I wasn't about to drag them into this mess before I had to. But I wasn't going to let her slither out of this with excuses, either. She'd talk, and she'd tell me the truth, for once. Where were you last night? The words came out harder than I expected, and she flinched, turning to look at me. There was a second, just a flicker, where I saw panic in her eyes. Then she plastered on that fake smile, the one she used when she knew she was in trouble but didn't want to admit it. I told you, I was out with the girls, she said, her voice too casual, too rehearsed. She took a sip of her coffee like that was the end of the conversation. I took a step forward, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Don't lie to me, Emily. I checked. You weren't out with the girls. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth, and the color drained from her face. She set the mug down carefully, like she needed to control her movements, but her fingers were trembling. Good. I wanted her to feel the same fear I'd felt when I found that hotel keycard, when I realized she'd been betraying me behind my back. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice softer now, less certain. I pulled the keycard from my pocket and tossed it onto the table in front of her. Eagle Crest Inn. Room 214. Ring any bells? Her face went white as a sheet. For a moment, I thought she might actually pass out. But then she recovered, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the card like it was a snake about to bite her. That's not mine, she said quickly, pushing the card away like it burned her fingers. I slammed my hand down on the table, making her jump. Don't. You. Dare. Don't sit there and lie to me, Emily. I know where you were. I went to the hotel this morning. Room 214. They told me the room's still occupied. So go ahead, explain that. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. That's when I knew she had no more excuses left. The game was over. You think I'm stupid? I asked, my voice rising. I could feel the anger bubbling up, and I was done holding it back. You think I wouldn't figure it out? All those late nights, all those times you came home smelling like perfume, like you'd just been somewhere you didn't want me to know about. You've been lying to me for months, haven't you? She swallowed hard, still not saying anything. I wasn't sure if she was more afraid of me or the truth finally coming out, but I wasn't going to let her silence stop me. Who is he? I demanded, leaning in closer. Who the hell are you sleeping with, Emily? I deserve to know. I'm not leaving this table until you tell me. She looked like she wanted to run, but she was trapped. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, she let out a shaky breath and looked down at the table, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not what you think. Don't give me that bullshit, I snapped, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. Who is he? She wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. It's just someone from work. Weak God, I don't even know how it started, okay? I was stressed, we were having problems, and one thing led to another. The words hit me like a freight train. I had expected it, sure. Hell, I'd known it deep down the second I saw that keycard. But hearing her admit it, actually hearing her say the words, made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. The room spun for a second, and I had to remind myself to breathe. How long? I asked, my voice shaking despite how hard I was trying to keep it steady. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, wiping at her eyes again. A few months. I closed my eyes, my fists tightening. A few months. Months of her lying to me, going behind my back, sleeping with some other guy while I stayed home with the kids, thinking everything was fine. I felt sick to my stomach. How many nights had I kissed her goodnight, completely clueless, while she was thinking about him? Who is he? I asked again, more quietly this time. She didn't answer at first, just sat there, biting her lip like she didn't want to tell me. Like she was still trying to protect him. That just made me angrier. I said, who is he? She flinched at my tone and finally whispered his name. Eric. I froze. Eric. Eric, the guy she'd introduced me to at her company's holiday party last year. The guy I'd shaken hands with and chatted about sports with, thinking he was just another one of her coworkers. The same Eric who'd been at our house for a barbecue 2 months ago. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped over. Eric? You're telling me you've been screwing Eric? In our house? At our parties? She didn't say anything, just buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I didn't feel sorry for her. Not even a little. All I felt was rage, this burning fury that had been building for months, maybe even years, and now it was threatening to explode. I couldn't stay there. If I did, I wasn't sure what I'd do. I needed air, needed to get out before I completely lost it. I grabbed my jacket and stormed toward the front door, barely aware of what I was doing. Behind me, I could hear her calling my name, her voice shaky and desperate, but I ignored her. I wasn't going to listen to another word. I slammed the door behind me and stood in the driveway, breathing heavily, trying to get a grip on myself. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and somewhere down the street, I could hear kids playing. It was such a normal day, such a peaceful scene, and it felt like a sick joke. Because inside my head, everything was falling apart. I looked back at the house, my fists clenched. That's where we'd raised our kids, celebrated birthdays, spent holidays together. And now it felt like a lie. I couldn't look at it without seeing her and Eric sneaking around behind my back, probably laughing at how clueless I was. I had no idea what to do next. I couldn't just walk away, but I couldn't go back in there and act like this hadn't happened. This was the kind of betrayal you don't recover from, the kind that changes everything. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let her off easy. She wasn't going to cry her way out of this. There would be consequences. I was going to make sure of it. I stood outside for what felt like hours, letting the rage settle in my bones. The air was too cold for early spring, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, jumping from thought to thought, but always coming back to one thing, revenge. Emily's sobs still echoed in my ears, but I couldn't let myself soften, couldn't let her crocodile tears twist me up any more than they already had. She deserved this. And now, she'd face the consequences. I wasn't the type to forgive. Not for something like this. When we stood at that altar 12 years ago, I believed we were making a promise that meant something. For better or worse, sure, but cheating? Sneaking around with some sleazebag from work? That wasn't part of the deal. She'd broken it. So now, I was going to break her. But I wasn't going to do it in the heat of the moment. I wasn't stupid. There was a right way to get even, to make her feel what I was feeling. I wasn't just going to storm back in there, shout, and flip tables. That was too easy. No, I had something else in mind. Something that would stick. I started by calling the best divorce attorney I knew. Ryan Blackstone. The guy was ruthless, a pit bull in a suit. We'd gone to college together, and I knew for a fact he'd shredded a few lives in court. If anyone could help me destroy Emily financially and legally, it was him. Ryan, it's Jake. I need a favor, I said when he picked up. Jake? What's going on, man? I caught Emily cheating. I'm divorcing her. There was a pause, then he let out a low whistle. Damn. That sucks. I'm sorry, man. Yeah, well, I'm not looking for sympathy, I snapped. I need your help. I want her to walk away with nothing. I want the house, the kids, everything. Ryan didn't miss a beat. All right. You'll need proof of the affair. Do you have any? I've got enough to start with, I said, thinking of the hotel keycard in Emily's teary confession. Can you make sure she doesn't see a dime? I don't want her getting a penny from me. I'll do everything I can, he assured me. But there are laws, you know. She'll get something, even if we nail her for adultery. I don't care about the legal stuff. Just do what you can to screw her over, I said, my voice cold. She's not walking out of this with her life intact. All right, man. I'll get started. We'll hit her hard. I hung up and leaned back against the car. Step 1 was in motion. I wasn't going to let her coast through this and pretend everything was okay. This divorce was going to crush her. I'd make sure of it. But I wasn't done yet. This was just the legal side. I had something more personal in mind, too. Emily thought she could get away with sneaking around with Eric? Thought I wouldn't find out? Well, I was going to make sure her little secret wasn't a secret anymore. Not to Eric's wife. Not to their coworkers. Not to anyone who mattered. I knew where Eric lived. That much was easy. Emily had mentioned his house in passing before, back when I didn't think twice about him. A real upstanding guy with a wife and 2 kids of his own. Looked perfect on paper, just like us. Except now, I knew the truth. He was a lying piece of trash, just like her. I pulled up his address on my phone, memorized it, and headed for the car. If Emily wanted to wreck our marriage, then I was going to wreck hers. I wasn't sure how, but I'd figure it out. I always did. Eric's house was just as bland and perfect as I expected, cookie-cutter, suburban, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a shiny black SUV in the driveway. I parked down the street, out of sight, and took a minute to calm myself. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet. I had a few ideas, but nothing solid. One thing was for sure, I wasn't going to leave here without making sure his wife knew what was really going on. I waited until I saw movement inside the house. A woman, probably Eric's wife, moving through the kitchen, and kids running around in the living room. The sight of them made my blood boil. How many nights had Eric been here, playing the good husband and father, while he was sneaking off with my wife? How many lies had he told to keep this charade going? I climbed out of the car and walked straight up to the front door, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and nerves. I was about to blow up 2 lives, 3 if you counted his kids. But I didn't care. They deserved this. I rang the doorbell. It only took a few seconds for the door to open, and there she was, Eric's wife. She looked like a typical suburban mom, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a smile that faded the second she saw the look on my face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm here about your husband," I said bluntly. "Eric." Her eyes widened, and she glanced back into the house, clearly confused. "What about him?" I could feel the words on the tip of my tongue, ready to spill out. I was about to tell her everything, lay it all bare. But at the last second, something stopped me. Maybe it was the kids playing in the background. Maybe it was the sudden realization that I didn't want to be the guy who ruined her life with a few angry words. I wasn't here for her. I was here for Eric. I need to talk to him, I said instead, my voice flat. Is he home? She looked even more confused now. He's not. He's at work. Can I ask what this is about? Just tell him Jake stopped by, I said, turning on my heel and walking back to the car before she could ask anything else. I didn't need to destroy her in the process. I'd find another way to get back at him. I spent the next 2 days planning. I wasn't going to rush into this, not when I had the perfect opportunity to make sure everyone knew what kind of person Emily and Eric really were. I wanted it to be public, humiliating. I wanted it to hurt. I started by gathering all the evidence I could. Emails. Texts. Anything I could find that would show their affair in all its ugly detail. I wasn't sure how long this had been going on, but I was going to find out. And when I did, I was going to make sure their coworkers, their families, hell, the whole town knew what they'd been up to. Eric worked at the same company as Emily, which made it even easier. I knew a couple of people there, and it wasn't hard to get my hands on some contact information. I started drafting an anonymous email, attaching every piece of evidence I had. I wasn't subtle about it. The subject line read, "Your coworker's affair." It was petty, sure. Vindictive. But I didn't care. I wanted them both to burn. And this was only the beginning. Next, I made sure to print everything out. Physical copies. I wasn't going to let them claim this was some digital hoax. I wanted something tangible, something they couldn't ignore. I spent hours in my office, printing page after page of texts, emails, anything that showed their affair in plain black and white. And then, the final step. I packaged it all up in a neat little folder, addressed it to the head of HR at their company. I wasn't just going to ruin their personal lives, I was going to make sure they couldn't even show their faces at work without everyone knowing what kind of people they were. Eric might have been her boss, but after this? He'd be lucky if he kept his job. The envelope was thick with evidence by the time I sealed it up, and I felt a strange kind of satisfaction as I stared at it. This was it. This was how I was going to make sure they paid for what they'd done. The next morning, I dropped the envelope off at the office personally, walking in like it was just another day. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I handed it over. "This is for HR," I said, and she nodded, tossing it into a pile with the rest of the mail. It was done. Now all I had to do was wait. I walked out of the building feeling lighter than I had in days. It wasn't over yet, there was still the divorce, still the fallout with the kids to handle. But I'd started something, and there was no going back now. They were both going to pay. The next few days passed in a blur of numbness. I'd done everything I could to set my plan in motion. I'd dropped off the evidence, I'd spoken to my lawyer, and now I was just waiting for the fallout. Emily had been tiptoeing around the house, avoiding me as much as she could, like some wounded animal waiting for the final blow. She knew what was coming. I didn't need to tell her. The kids, Daniel and Sophie, noticed something was off, but they didn't ask. I tried my best to shield them from the tension. I didn't want them to see what was happening between us, not yet, anyway. But it was only a matter of time before they'd start to understand that something was wrong, and I wasn't sure how I was going to explain it. How do you tell your kids that their mother isn't who you thought she was? That she'd destroyed the family for some fling with her boss? Emily finally cornered me in the living room on a Thursday night. The kids were in bed, and I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV. I could see her out of the corner of my eye, hovering by the door, like she was trying to summon the courage to speak. "Jake," she said quietly, almost a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't ready to have this conversation, not after everything. But I knew it had to happen sooner or later. So I muted the TV and turned to face her. "What?" She flinched at the coldness in my voice but stepped forward, wringing her hands together. We need to talk. I crossed my arms, leaning back on the couch, keeping my expression as flat as possible. About what? We've said everything that needs to be said. She bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. It was the same routine I'd seen her pull before, the guilt, the regret. But I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. I'm sorry, Jake, she whispered, her voice cracking. I never meant for any of this to happen. She broke off, wiping at her eyes, like that would somehow make me forget what she'd done. I stood up, unable to sit there and listen to her excuses any longer. You're sorry? That's all you've got? After everything? You're sorry? She stepped back as I approached her, her eyes wide, like she hadn't expected me to react like this. Like she thought her tears would soften me. They didn't. I'm sorry, she repeated, her voice trembling. I don't know what I was thinking, Jake. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? I cut her off, my voice rising. Do you even hear yourself right now? You've been sneaking around with Eric for months, Emily. Months. And you're going to stand there and tell me you didn't want to hurt me? I made a mistake, she cried, her voice breaking. I know I did, but I love you, Jake. I love our family. Please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can. Counseling? I let out a harsh laugh, the sound bitter in my own ears. You think counseling is going to fix this? You think some therapist is going to erase everything you've done? You betrayed me, Emily. You lied to me, to the kids. You threw our marriage away for some cheap fling with your boss. And now you want to fix it? She didn't say anything, just stood there crying, her shoulders shaking. It should have made me feel something. Pity, maybe. Sadness. But all I felt was cold anger. I'd loved this woman once, but now? Now, I barely recognized her. I'm filing for divorce, I said flatly. I watched her face crumble as the words hit her, but I didn't stop. You can take whatever you want from the house, but you're not getting the kids. I'm keeping the house, and I'm keeping them. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You can't take them from me, Jake. They're my kids too. They're my kids, I said, my voice hard. And I'm not letting them stay with you after what you've done. She was shaking now, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't care. Not anymore. Please, Jake, she begged, reaching out to me, but I stepped back, out of her reach. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job. I'll never see him again, I swear. Just, please, don't do this. Don't take the kids away from me. You should have thought about that before you cheated on me, I said coldly. This is your fault, Emily. You made this mess. Now you have to live with it. Her sobs grew louder, and for a second, I thought she might collapse. But I didn't move to help her. I just watched, arms crossed, feeling the last remnants of my love for her wither and die. For a long time, neither of us said anything. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the sound of her crying, but nothing else. It was like the world had gone quiet, waiting for me to make the next move. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. What about us, Jake? After all these years? Are you really going to throw it all away? I stared at her, and for the first time in days, I let myself really feel the weight of everything. All the years we'd spent together, all the memories we'd made, the life we'd built, it was all crumbling around us. And she was asking if I was going to throw it away? She had already done that. There is no us anymore, I said, my voice steady. You ended that when you started screwing Eric. She let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. I turned away, feeling the finality of it all settle in my chest. This was it. There was no going back now. I want you out by tomorrow, I said, heading for the stairs. Pack your things and leave. She didn't respond, just stood there, broken and crying. Part of me wanted to feel something, some sympathy, some regret, but I was too far gone. She had destroyed us, and there was no fixing it. I went upstairs, leaving her behind in the living room, and closed the door to our bedroom. Or maybe I should say my bedroom now. I collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The kids would need an explanation soon. I wasn't sure how I was going to do that yet, but it was coming. I couldn't protect them from this forever. And as much as I hated the thought, they deserved the truth. The next morning was a blur. I avoided Emily, staying upstairs while she packed her things. I heard her moving around the house, crying quietly, but I didn't go down. I couldn't face her, not again. Not after last night. By noon, she was gone. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't ask for another chance. She just left. The house was quiet after that. Too quiet. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where she had stood the night before, her words echoing in my head. What about us, Jake? After all these years? But the years didn't matter anymore. She'd killed whatever we had with her lies and betrayal, and now we were just nothing. That night, I told the kids. I sat them down at the kitchen table and explained, as best I could, that their mom wasn't going to be living with us anymore. That she had made some mistakes, and that we were getting a divorce. They cried, of course. Sophie, especially. She didn't understand, not really. She kept asking why, kept asking if things would go back to normal. But I didn't have any answers for her. All I could do was hold them and promise that I'd be there for them no matter what. Emily didn't try to call. She didn't come back to explain herself to the kids. She just disappeared. Maybe she was with Eric. Maybe she was staying at a friend's. I didn't care. As long as she stayed away. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. It was over. The lies, the deceit, the constant doubt, it was all done. Now, I just had to figure out how to move forward. The next week was filled with meetings with lawyers and trying to adjust to life without Emily. The kids were struggling, but I did my best to keep things stable for them. I wasn't sure what the future held, but at least I had control over something now. And as for Emily? She didn't fight the divorce. She didn't show up to contest anything. In the end, she got what she deserved, nothing. It took a full week before I could stand in the house and not feel the weight of Emily's betrayal pressing down on me. That empty space she left behind, both physically and emotionally, was a constant reminder that nothing was the same anymore. I kept thinking about how quickly it had all fallen apart. One day we were this picture-perfect family, the next I was explaining to Daniel and Sophie why their mother wasn't coming home. That conversation was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Daniel, being 10, was more aware than I'd expected. He didn't say much, but I could tell from the way his face twisted up as I explained the situation that he understood. Maybe not the details, but enough to know something had changed, something permanent. Sophie, though, she didn't get it. She cried and clung to me, asking if Mom was coming back. I had to tell her, over and over, that she wasn't. That this was how things were going to be from now on. She didn't stop crying that night. I put her to bed, and she cried herself to sleep, her little hands still gripping my shirt. The kids had been my main focus since Emily left. It was easier to concentrate on their needs, to keep myself busy with their routines, than to face the silence of the house when they were at school. The quiet moments, when I was alone, were the worst. That's when everything hit me. The anger, the sadness, the loss, it all crashed down on me like a wave I couldn't escape from. I tried not to think too much about Emily, but it was impossible. Every corner of the house had something that reminded me of her. Her favorite chair in the living room, the perfume bottle still sitting on the bathroom counter, the pictures on the wall. I hadn't gotten around to taking them down yet. Maybe I was avoiding it because doing that would make everything feel too final. As if what had happened wasn't real until those pictures came off the walls. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she left, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the papers Ryan had sent over about the divorce. It was straightforward and uncontested case. Emily hadn't fought for anything. Not the house, not custody, nothing. She'd signed everything, almost too easily, and Ryan had gotten me everything I asked for. Full custody of the kids, the house, all of it. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Winning didn't feel like winning when the whole thing felt like a loss from the start. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced down at the screen. It was Emily. Her name still showed up on the display, even though I hadn't spoken to her since that last night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear whatever excuse she had ready, whatever apology she was going to try to throw my way. But another part of me knew this was inevitable. I couldn't avoid her forever, not with the kids involved. With a deep breath, I swiped to answer. "What do you want, Emily?" There was a pause on the other end, just the sound of her breathing for a moment, and then she spoke. "Jake, her voice cracked. "I just wanted to check on the kids." "They're fine," I said flatly. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. "You didn't seem too worried about them when you left." She was quiet for a few seconds, then let out a shaky sigh. I know I messed up. I'm not calling to try and fix anything. I just wanted to hear how they're doing." "They're your kids, Emily. You don't need to ask me if you want to know how they're doing. You can pick up the phone and call them yourself." Another pause. I could almost picture her sitting there, probably in some rented apartment or a friend's spare room, struggling to figure out what to say next. "I don't know what to say to them," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to face them after what I did." "That's not my problem," I snapped, the anger flaring up again. "You should have thought about that before you blew up our family for some affair." Her voice broke when she spoke again. "I never wanted to hurt them, Jake. I didn't mean for it to get this far." I felt a bitter laugh bubbling up in my chest, but I swallowed it down. "You didn't mean for it to get this far? What did you think would happen? Did you think you could sneak around with Eric and no one would ever find out? That the kids wouldn't be affected?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I wasn't thinking. I was selfish, and I was wrong. I know that now." I clenched my jaw, biting back the harsh words I wanted to throw at her. I'd said everything I needed to say already. She knew what she'd done, and there was no point in rehashing it all over again. But I couldn't help myself. I couldn't just let her off with an apology. "You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You destroyed everything. And now you don't even have the guts to face your own kids and explain why their mother walked out." "I want to talk to them," she said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. I need some time to figure out what to say." "They don't need more excuses," I said coldly. "They need their mother. And I'm not going to keep covering for you while you figure out what to say. Either you're part of their lives, or you're not. But you can't just pick and choose when it's convenient for you." There was another long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she might have hung up. But then, finally, she spoke again. "I'm going to figure this out," she said, her voice steadier now, though still soft. "I'm going to be there for them. I promise. I just need a little more time." "Time's not going to fix this, Emily," I said. "But you better be ready to step up soon, because they're not going to wait forever." "I know," she whispered. "I know." I didn't say anything else, just ended the call and tossed the phone onto the table. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, wondering if I'd handled that right. Wondering if I could have said something different, done something differently. But in the end, it didn't matter. This wasn't about me or what I felt anymore. This was about the kids. And I was going to make damn sure they didn't suffer more than they already had. A few days later, Emily did call the kids. It was awkward, tense. I could hear Sophie's quiet voice, asking why Mommy wasn't home, and Emily's stumbling responses as she tried to explain without really explaining. Daniel didn't say much at all, but I could tell he was listening. He always listened, even when he didn't speak up. After the call, he went up to his room and didn't come out for the rest of the night. That was how things went for a while. Emily called every few days, but she didn't come by to see them. I wasn't sure if she was too ashamed to face me or if she was still trying to avoid seeing the mess she'd created. Either way, I didn't push her. I was done trying to make sense of her choices. As for me, I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the anger came rushing back, days when I couldn't help but replay everything in my head. But I had the kids to think about, and they needed stability. They needed to see that life could go on, even after something as painful as this. One morning, about a month after Emily left, I took the pictures down. All the framed photos of our family, the ones we'd taken on vacations, at birthday parties, during holidays. They all came down, one by one. It was strangely cathartic, like I was clearing out the last remnants of the life we'd had together. I didn't throw the pictures away, though. I couldn't. I packed them into a box and shoved it into the back of the closet. Maybe one day, the kids would want to see them again. Maybe I'd want to look back on those memories, too. But for now, they were just too painful. The divorce was finalized not long after. Ryan had done his job well. Emily signed off on everything, and just like that, it was over. We were officially done. There was no big moment of closure, no final confrontation, no dramatic goodbye. Emily and I became strangers, co-parents who only communicated when necessary. I didn't know what her life looked like now, and honestly, I didn't care. Life moved on. Slowly, awkwardly, but it moved on. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, looking up at the stars. I thought about everything that had happened over the last few months, the lies, the anger, the betrayal. I thought about how much I'd changed, how much everything had changed. But I also thought about the future. About the new life I was building for myself and my kids. A life where I didn't have to constantly wonder if the person I loved was lying to me. A life where I could finally breathe again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.